Okay, so I'm going to do a case study on Venclexta, venetoclax. It is the most recent drug that we have advocated for, and one that had some interesting outcomes. So the drug funding approval process in Canada is fairly complicated, as I'm sure it is in most countries. It's federally mandated for most of it. Health Canada initially assesses drugs submitted by the manufacturers to ensure safety. So they would be similar to the FDA in the US. But the difference with them is they are also responsible for that safety. So they have to make sure that they're doing the right thing. The Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review is the next process that manufacturers submit to, and it is part of CADTH, which is the Canadian Agency for Drug and Health Technologies. So this is who the manufacturers report or submit to, and this is where patients can register and and clinicians as well can register and have the ability to provide input to this process. The next review board is the Patented Medicines Price Review Board, and it determines, again, it's a federal agency, and it determines the maximum reimbursement allowed. And they actually use a basket of different countries, including the US and about 6 other European countries, to determine what price would be valid to charge, and then they come up with a range. It currently has just undergone some review, and they're just coming out with some new guidelines. Then we have a new agency, the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, and they actually are responsible for negotiating with the manufacturers for price. And they do this, again, federally on behalf of all the provinces and territories. Finally, then, the provinces and the territories make their own decisions to fund, because they're the ones who have the healthcare money. It's provided by the federal government, but they are able to use that money as they wish to use it for. Now, some of the provinces do allow patient input, and you can register as a patient, but often if it's gone through the PCOTA process, they don't bother to ask for more input. Quebec is separate in all of this. They're not included in the PCOTA reviews. They have their own review. So then we will also submit to the Quebec review called INES, and I'm not going to bother you with the words for that acronym. So we've gone through a couple of submissions for venetoclax in Canada. The first one started in July of 2016. We're given notice a couple months ahead by PCOTA that this application is coming. And then the manufacturer submits the funding request and with the indication for what they want it used for. So the first submission was for the treatment of patients with CLL who've received at least one prior therapy and have a 17p deletion. We are given 2 weeks after the manufacturer submits to provide our submission. So because of that 2-month lead time, that gives us an opportunity to connect with our patients and to come up with this submission, because it's quite a process, as you can imagine. The initial recommendation is usually provided about 4 to 5 months later. And for this submission or request, PERC, which is the PCOTA Expert Review Committee, did not recommend the reimbursement of venetoclax. So we were pretty disappointed, but PERC goes through clinical benefit, they go through patient-based values, they do an economic evaluation, and they do adoption feasibility. So they include all of that in their process. We weren't given the opportunity to provide a response to this because shortly after, AbbVie decided to voluntarily withdraw their submission for venetoclax. So we did another submission. So again, a year later, AbbVie submitted a funding request to PCOTA as a monotherapy for venetoclax, and for this time, It was for treatment of patients with CLL who have received at least one prior therapy and who have failed a B-cell receptor inhibitor. That would be something like ibrutinib or idelalisib. There's nothing about 17p in that submission. This time, the CLL Patient Advocacy Group joined with Lymphoma Canada to prepare this submission. And in November, we again received a negative response from PERC. So at this point, we're thinking, okay, this is crazy. It's being approved around the world. What is the problem here? So PERC said that they were unable to conclude that based on the submitted evidence, there was a net clinical benefit of venetoclax compared with appropriate comparators. But in their response, in their recommendation, they did recognize that there was a need for additional effective treatments. So that was good. They did recognize that venetoclax produces anti-tumor activity. They did say that venetoclax partially aligns with patient values, i.e. it's an additional treatment option. They did note that it had an oral route of administration, so it was going to be cheaper than doing an IV route. They did say that it could not be considered cost-effective compared with available therapies, and what they were comparing it to was rituximab and high-dose methylprednisone. Like, those are two really cheap drugs out there right now. So, of course, a drug that's going to cost $100,000 a year is never going to compare to those two drugs. They did say that the potential budget impact was likely underestimated and could be substantial. So it really came down to the money. And one interesting thing they did note was they used the number of deaths in Canada of patients from CLL as the number of patients who would probably use this drug, which just blew my mind that they would use that as, who knows what else those patients would have died of. It doesn't mean they would have needed venetoclax. So in December, Lymphoma Canada and we got together to give feedback as registered patient group. And to our surprise, in March, the final recommendation issued was a conditional reimbursement if an improvement in cost until there's more robust clinical data made available for a future assessment. So we were pretty happy to get this. It was more than we expected because we really thought they might turn it down again. But as of today, the provinces are still under negotiation with the manufacturer. So it is not being paid for. It's being offered through a support program with AbbVie. So patients do have access to it, but it is not being paid for other than by AbbVie, for which we are very grateful. So how did we engage patients in this process? We did two different surveys. The first one was in March 2016. We included patients and caregivers, and the links to the surveys were distributed to the CLL Patient Advocacy Group and CLL Support Association UK members. We were working with Nick York because they knew they had a venetoclax submission coming up soon. We posted links on various websites and on social media and different online forums. We did build skip logic into the survey so that respondents were only asked questions that were relevant to them. We did not ask for patients that had only had experience with this drug. We wanted an overall survey that included other information about CLL and how people coped with CLL. So we received 248 responses. 6 of them had venetoclax experience. There wasn't a lot of venetoclax being used in Canada at the time. It was only in trials. So if you look at the chart, most of the patients with experience came from the U.S., and most of the respondents came from the U.S. And CLL-PAG has a large U.S. contingent within our database. We're very close in terms of borders, and they do attend some of the events that we have. But we also received responses from the UK, Australia, Belgium, Brazil, New Zealand, Norway, Scotland, and Sweden, and one caregiver from Ireland. and I think he's sitting here. In June 2017, we did another survey because we decided to include more quality of life information in that survey. We really are concerned about survey fatigue because patients get a little bit tired of that. So we do try to keep it down to a minimum. Again, we distributed to the CLL Patient Advocacy Group and the Lymphoma Canada databases and posted links on the various websites as well as the different online forums. For this survey, we received 320 responses, and 21 of those had venetoclax experience, and again, an increased number from caregivers as well. And Canada had a lot more respondents this time, almost equaling what the U.S. had. Again, quite a few from the U.K., some from Australia, and some from Brazil, France, India, and Israel. So it was wide-reaching. We do recognize the fact that our survey is done in English, and that does eliminate a large amount of the population, but we welcome anybody to respond to these surveys and to give us feedback on how they deal with their CLL. So then the response that we had to that recommendation, we obviously disagreed with it, and we did not support the conversion to the final recommendation. It's basically just a form letter that you fill out. And why? Well, because in that recommendation, they said there was positive clinical guidance reports. So their own clinicians sitting on that committee said this drug should be reimbursed. The registered clinicians and patient advocacy groups also said, you know, we support this drug. We think this is a valuable drug. They knew that there was need for an effective treatment for a subset of patients who had failed the BCRIs. There was nothing left out there. Those people had a death sentence if this drug wasn't approved. They admitted that waiting for more mature overall survival data when there was a clear overall survival benefit demonstrated meant that there was an unacceptable delay for patients who really had no reasonable treatment options remaining. And PERC agreed itself that the results were promising. Now, this was a phase 2 trial, and so I think they were a little concerned that they didn't want to start approving drugs that hadn't been fully vetted on phase 3 trials. So what did we do? We gave some feedback. We said, okay, the data was sufficient to obtain approval for this drug and for reimbursement in Finland, France, Norway, Denmark, Germany, Israel, Italy, Scotland, Belgium, Austria, the Netherlands, Slovakia, Luxembourg, and the UK. So why isn't it good enough for you guys? We said it was unacceptable to risk patients' lives with a randomized clinical trial and expose patients to ineffective toxic therapies when we knew venetoclax worked for them. And when they said themselves that there are no other effective treatment options in this group. So we used their own information in their recommendation and threw it back at them. They weren't sure that patient values were met. That was one of their concerns. And we're like, these people are alive. How much more can that meet patient values? And 80% of the people on the venetoclax trials were alive at 12 months. And the median progression-free survival and overall survivals hadn't been reached yet. They acknowledged that this patient population usually has a median progression-free survival of less than 6 months. And the clinicians actually said it was 3 months. And we basically said, so a longer remission, which you're indicating yourselves, and being alive completely align with patient values. Patients with venetoclax experience reported manageable side effects while taking the medication. That was another thing they brought up, was the tumor lysis situation with venetoclax. But it had long been resolved by the dose escalation, starting at a low dose and ramping it up. So it really was not an issue for the most part. And that's my part. I'm going to hand it over to Liz, and then we can answer questions together later.
So in addition to accepting patient group input, PCODR, for about the past 2.5 years, has started accepting clinician input on a voluntary basis. And I should note that clinicians have, of course, always been involved in this process, but they are involved on the expert review committee. They may or may not be experts in the particular indication and drug being reviewed. And there is a clinical guidance panel who are typically experts in the indication being reviewed, but they are, however, selected by the agency, PCODR, that is obviously doing this assessment. So this is an opportunity, an additional opportunity for clinicians across the country to participate on a voluntary basis. And it also, the initiative really was begun because they did want different information. They didn't just want the clinical an assessment and evaluation and interpretation of the clinical trial data, but they really wanted insight at the regional and local level from physicians who are practicing in the community and also at larger academic centers. And so some examples of information that they were looking for included how well the drug is tolerated, side effects management, how difficult it would be to manage the side effects, what expertise would be required, how easy is the drug to administer in the clinical setting, whether there was interest for an RCT or a need for an RCT in the community. Sorry, a randomized clinical trial. Did you change that? And how important clinicians feel it is to have the treatment reimbursed. So just a quick overview. Clinicians have the same opportunity to participate, or the opportunity to participate at the same parts of the process as the patients. So at the initial submission, after the manufacturer submits their request. And then also after the initial recommendation is issued, they are able to provide feedback as well. So I don't know how it is in in your country, but in Canada, I would say that the majority of oncologists and hematologists either are not aware of the drug approval and reimbursement process, or they don't understand it fully. So getting them to participate in a process that they're either not aware of or don't understand, or in many cases too, do not necessarily see the value of, because they view it as a government trying to check a box on their list of input, it creates some issues. So in order to get them to participate, there is a lot of awareness and education and outreach involved. And PCODR didn't really take this into account when they started this program. They just assumed that the clinicians would come running and volunteer to participate, and they'd have lots of input. This, in fact, was not the case, but unfortunately, PCODR interpreted this as, in some cases, where clinicians didn't provide input, that perhaps that meant that this drug was not important enough in the clinical community to be reimbursed. So this is where, which is obviously devastating for patients, but this is where the patient groups can come in and play a role, and Lymphoma Canada did take this on to help facilitate clinician submissions. And clinicians can provide submissions individually, but they can also provide them as a group. So we help facilitate group physicians, where we reach out to lead clinicians, experts in the Canadian lymphoma and CLL treatment areas. And sometimes the first one we contact agrees to participate and write the submission. They're fully on board. Other times it takes 5 or 6 different contacts to find someone who has the time to participate, is available or willing. But once we get their written submission, then we reach out as an organization, contact additional physicians across the provinces who have experience with the indication and sometimes even the drug under review to support the submission. And then, of course, we have to guide the clinicians through the registration process with the agency and all the required forms and make sure they know the deadlines. And many of them have not figured out that an electronic signature can save them a lot of time, so they still, scan and fax and do all those things that the rest of us left behind years ago. And then, we collate all the documents, give them to the lead physician who submits them online to the group. So in terms of there's been a lot of new lymphoma drugs coming to market, I think, in most of our countries. And our scientific advisory board actually elected to lead clinician submissions on behalf of the Canadian lymphoma submission. And of course, again, we have to inform our scientific advisory board of upcoming submission deadlines. And they typically recommend a lead physician either within the board or in the broader lymphoma community. And again, we go through that process with them. So in terms of the venetoclax submission, and this is the second round, I'm not going to go through the first round that Deborah went through, but we actually were able to get 11 CLL treaters, hematologists, oncologists, from 7 different provinces across the country to support a joint clinician submission. And I think this speaks to the both the need and the support, for the drug, this particular drug in the clinical community. And the submission was actually written by a very well-respected Canadian CLL specialist, a hematologist in Alberta, who is very involved in CLL clinical trials and has also spearheaded national clinical CLL clinical treatment guidelines initiative with Lymphoma Canada. And the submission provided insight into, first and foremost, the lack of a standard of care in this patient population, the toxicity of existing treatments that were ineffective, underlying the high unmet need. They did talk about, even though they didn't all necessarily have experience with the drug, what they predicted the benefits would be and which subgroups would potentially benefit the most from this treatment. They also talked about the expertise and resources necessary to manage potential side effects, the sequencing of the treatment with respect to existing therapies, and the ease of use in daily practice. And of course, we know that PCODER came back with an initial negative recommendation. And this was really the first time that the hematologists, the clinical community in Canada, actually got their backs up and were incensed that this decision came back. There had been previous negative recommendations, and for the most part, they sort of shrugged their shoulders and said, yeah, this is kind of what we expected. This is the way it's going. When there's no randomized clinical trial data, it seems that they're going to issue a negative recommendation. However, in this case, the clinical community really rallied, behind this, or I guess in front of this decision, and provided some very strongly worded and pointed feedback about the PERC's interpretation of the clinical evidence, as well as their interpretation of patient values and what is important to patients, and the feasibility of conducting a randomized control trial. So you can see a few of their comments up here. Regarding the tolerability of the treatment, their interpretation of gaps in the data, And the clinician feedback also aligned very nicely, although we did not compare notes, with the patient group feedback. And they actually brought forward the point about patient values as well, in recognizing that, patients recognize the lack of other treatment options for CLL after progressing on BCR inhibitor therapy, and that the therapy is very well tolerated, and this is not an issue for patients. Also, the issue around the feasibility of conducting a randomized control trial was brought up a few times in their feedback. And they did mention very pointedly that it would be unethical to expose patients to an unproven and risky therapy just because it is less expensive than the proven alternative. And also that, the absolute requirement for phase 3 data is not reasonable for this type of rare disease or this small indication, and it deprives needy patients of the opportunity to access valuable new effective therapies. And this last point I'm emphasizing because this has become a trend, I think, not just in Canada, but in other countries in Europe and around the world, where the health technology assessment bodies are using the lack of randomized controlled trial data as somewhat of an excuse to issue a negative recommendation. And in Canada, this has been happening more and more. I would say for the past 3 years, there have been more treatments that have been submitted to the reimbursement bodies that come with non-comparative data. For the most part, these are in small patient populations, either because, this is a heavily pretreated population and they're at the at the end of, really their options, or it is a specific subset of patients within a tumor group. And there just aren't enough patients around the world to conduct a randomized controlled trial in a timely manner. Perhaps if you had 20 years to determine whether this therapy was better than the existing treatment, that might be feasible, but really that, will never advance treatment in that manner. So around the same time that the venetoclax file was going through the system, a number of cancer patient groups in Canada were becoming very concerned about this trend in the reimbursement decisions. And so we got together and decided that this needed to be addressed, it needed to be highlighted, people needed to know about it, and we needed to provide solutions really for this lack of access to these new therapies in Canada. So along with a couple of very experienced patient advocates in Canada who have a lot of knowledge around the drug approval and reimbursement system, we got together and wrote a white paper where we outlined what was going on in the Canadian landscape. We addressed the issue of the feasibility of randomized controlled trials and listed the reasons why this wasn't, they may not be feasible. We looked at how this affects patients, and then we did provide recommendations for how we could improve and accelerate access to these therapies while still, managing the uncertainties in the data that's collected. And this paper was it was supported by a dozen other cancer patient groups in Canada. And we did circulate it to to PCODER and policymakers around the country, and we talked about it in meetings and webinars. And I have no idea whether this made any difference in the venetoclax conditional reimbursement, but their recommendation included, in fact, the improvement in cost effectiveness until more robust clinical data is made available was one of our recommendations. And in terms of generating that data, there were different options for that, but we were quite pleased that, they perhaps, hopefully, took this into account when they were reversing their decision. And I should note that this was actually the first, PCODER's been around since about 2013, so for about 5 years. I believe they've reviewed now probably 30, 40 different drug files. This is the first negative recommendation that they have actually reversed, which, whether or not, again, this makes a difference in terms of whether the provinces decide to fund it. I mean, we are obviously hopeful, but we do view this as a step forward. And this was, I think, in large part because both the patient communities and the clinical communities and the patient advocacy efforts, we all came together, coalesced, and advocated for this. And that is it.